So some time ago, I created a tutorial that used utility nodes to essentially develop a stretchy leg setup, which was similar to one that was expression based. But I wanted to sort of simplify it and hopefully make something that wouldn't be so dependent on the evaluation of a conditional node or an expression node or an expression. So for this stretchy setup, it's actually pretty simple. You're going to need essentially a joint structure. It doesn't have to be complicated, or it can be complicated. It doesn't really matter with this setup. But basically you need to know which joint you're starting with and which joint you're ending with. And then within that setup you need to basically make certain connections. So what we're going to need for this setup is two multiply divide nodes. And so first we're going to go to Window, Rendering Editors, and bring up our Hypershade. And then from the Hypershade, you can go to Utilities. As you can see, I have a couple of nodes from the leg I already have in here. But if you need to create utility nodes, you go to Utilities on the Create tab, and then you scroll down until you find the Multiply Divide node. Click it once to create the node. You can double click it to bring it up in your attribute editor, and then we can name it. Usually it's a good idea to name them specifically, especially based on what they're going to be used for. So I'm going to use this one for my left leg, and so I'm going to call it my mdiv underscore left underscore, and we'll have this one be the scale control, or we can call it stretch. Okay, then we're going to need one more to evaluate the scale of the rig. So all you have to do is press Control or Command D on your keyboard while you have that node selected, and then change it to mdiv left, and we'll call this one scale, or just to be more specific, global scale. Okay. Now with the first node, which is going to control our stretching, mdiv left stretch, set the operation to divide. Okay, and now we can leave those nodes for now and come back for them later. Next, we're going to need to actually decide where the stretch is going to occur. Is it going to occur from hip to knee, from knee to ankle? If it's going to be from knee to ankle, make that decision ahead of time. And then we need to actually measure the distance. Now, some people prefer to measure basically all the way down the joint chain. That can be done. But just to keep it simple, you can just go straight from hip to ankle. So under your Create menu, go to Measure Tools and choose Distance. Now as soon as you choose that tool, it will switch your manipulator to this little crosshair, and then all you have to do is start clicking on the joints, or in this case we're going to use point snap. So if you press V as in vet on your keyboard and then left click on the joint that you want to start from, it'll create a little locator. And then if you still holding V on the keyboard, click at, let's say, the ankle of your joint structure, it'll create another locator, and you'll get the distance measure shape connecting between the locators, showing the distance from hip to ankle. Okay, so once we actually have our distance dimension created, which is measuring the distance between our hip and our ankle, what we need to do then is we need to actually take that distance, open up the attribute editor by pressing Control A on the keyboard, and we need to choose the tab that's labeled Distance Dimension Shape. Okay, now with that tab opened, at the very bottom of the attribute editor you can click on the Select button to actually select that shape, and then you go to Window, General Editors, Connection Editor to load that dimension shape up in your outputs. And at the very bottom of that, we'll actually have the distance value that we need to feed into a multiply divide node. Now we only need to feed it into one. We need to feed it into the stretch multiply divide node. So bring up your Hypershade again from Window, Rendering Editors, Hypershade, and choose your Multiply Divide node for the stretch. Then you want to reload the right side, and you want to feed your distance value into the first input. Okay? Next, we need to feed one more thing into our Multiply Divide stretch. We need to feed our MDiv that's going to evaluate the scale of the rig. And so we're going to take our MDiv left global scale and load that into our left side so that we can feed its output X into the input X of our MDiv left stretch. And this way, so that when the rig actually scales, it will that value will be updated by the scale, fed in by the global scale. We'll feed it directly to our stretch node so that it can make sure that the distance, which will be different when the character scales, will be consistent. Okay. So now we have those nodes connected together. So now we need to go into our global scale node, and on that input, we need to tell it on input 1 what the default scale is. Okay, and our default scale is 2.969. We'll round it to the nearest 3 decimal points. Okay, and our default scale is 1. Okay, so if the scale increases once I finish hooking this up, it'll basically multiply into our distance value to update it accordingly. So let's say I'm going to create a temporary global control curve. So we'll create a circle, use that as the global for a rig. Okay, so I'm going to take my rig and just take my curve, go to its scale, make sure it's frozen at the default 1. I'm going to change the name to we'll call it scale main. And then I'll make sure that my rig recognizes it as its global. Okay? So now to continue, now we have those attributes hooked in, we need to actually take our multiply divide nodes, specifically the stretch node, and we need to connect it in to control the scale of the joints in our leg. So the joints that it's going to need to actually control the scale of would be the hip, both knees, but not the ankle. Only everything leading up to the ankle. The ankle is basically the end of our chain. Okay? So we can select each one of those joints and load those into the connection editor to start making connections. So I'm going to select each one of the joints in reverse. And the scale we're going to need to feed into is actually going to be the scale X, because that's the axis feeding through the joint chain. See, if I actually scale along the x-axis, the leg gets longer. And that's exactly what we want to happen. Okay? Except we want to do it when we actually just grab a specific control and pull it. So, go to Window, General Editors, Connection Editor. And we're going to feed into the joint, so I'm going to load them up on my input side. So I'm going to reload the right side to make sure it has all the joints loaded into it. Then under the right display option in its connection editor menu, I'm going to disable show non-keyable so that it just shows the top level attributes for the joints. And so what we're going to need to connect to is the scale. So you actually need to expand the scale so you can see the scale X. And you expand just by clicking the little plus inside of the circle. And so now on our left side in the outputs, we need to load in our multiply divide node. We need to load in the multiply divide left stretch. And so I'm going to reload that and load that in. Now by default this one's set up to divide, so it's basically its current length divided by its default length is going to equal to 1, which is our default scale. And so we need to feed the output from input X out to the scale X of each one of the joints. So click on output X and then left click on scale X for each one of the joints that should be affected by the stretching. Okay? And it's just that simple. That's done. So next we need to have something actually control the change in distance between our locators that are actually measuring the distance from hip to ankle. So first what I'm going to do is I'm going to select both locators and I'm just going to scale them down a bit using the local scale value in the channels box, just so that they're a little less prominent. Although we can actually hide them later, I just like to scale them down just a little bit. Okay, so first we're going to take the one at the hip, and we can actually take that one and we can parent or constrain it directly to our hip joint. Or if you're concerned about it being affected by the scale, you can simply select it and you just need to anchor it to something that's going to keep it in that location. So you could parent it to your root, but actually connecting it directly to the hip is actually a better idea so that its pivot point is always aligned. So I'm going to select the hip joint, I'm going to shift select the locator itself. Actually before that, I think I'm going to name it. So we'll just call it locator underscore left, and we'll say hip dist for distance. So hip joint, locator, constrain, and we can do a point constraint. It doesn't need to pay attention to orientation or anything like that. It just needs to stay aligned. So I'm just going to point constrain it right there, and so that's where it's going to stay. And now with the locator that's nearest the ankle, we're going to do something a little different with this, because we don't want to hook it into the joint structure it's going to help control. We need this one to actually pay attention to another control. In this case, it would probably most likely be a foot control as part of maybe an IKFK setup. So just for argument's sake, I'm going to create a control to link to it. And I'm going to snap align that using point snapping with the ankle, scale it down a bit, and then freeze transform it, and we'll call this our IK leg left. Okay, so now that's in place. So now I'm just going to take, we can do the same thing here. I can select my curve, shift select my locator. Again, you could rename your locator. You could even just duplicate the name that's on the hip control, except you're going to take that name and just change hip to ankle. And again, this is just so that in case you need to repair something or you're passing the rig off to someone else, they can sort of figure out what you did eventually. So shift select that control, or select that control, shift select the locator, constrain, point constrain, maintaining offset. This way, now our control is manipulating our locator. And as you can see, because of all the connections that are currently going into the joints, that are currently going into our multiply divide nodes, that it's highlighting, showing that there is an incoming connection. So when I actually start pulling on my control, you can see that the leg is already stretching. And so that's already the first part of the setup. Now, the one part of the setup that does get a little tricky is this last part. So if I want to make sure that my IK is actually going to work properly, so that the leg will actually bend, I need to prevent these joints from essentially going below 1, so that the defaults will kick in whenever I try to go negative, or shall I say up, to raise the leg. So I decided to try something pretty simple. So if I actually select my joints one at a time, and I go to the attribute editor and I go to the limit information, I have scale. Okay? And so we can actually see an incoming scale value. There's no minimum set. If I set the minimum so that the minimum is 1, and I do that for each joint that's being affected by our scale change, if I stretch, that works perfectly. Now if I try to contract the leg, instead of stretching, it stays straight. And it stays straight because I don't have an IK yet, but it also stays the same length that I need it to be because it's not allowed to go below 1. Fairly simple. Now the last part of setting up your leg so that it will perform normally is to, of course, add the IK handle. So once you add your IK handle, hip to ankle, and then we grab our control. Sorry, we take our IK handle, and then let's say we parent it or constrain it, either one, to our control curve. If we translate the control curve up, now the leg bends, and if we extend it outward, it scales up. Now, some people have been expressed concern about the fact that the leg is partially bent, so it's not actually completely straightening out. Now, if you've actually built your model with a straight leg, it's pretty close to perfectly straight, but if it's not, you can easily go in and make adjustments for it. For example, you can come in, click on the leg joint, we can go to our global scale, and we can actually make that value a little higher, so that if I put it, let's say 2.98, if I put it at 2.98, when I pull it, now notice now that it allows the leg to straighten out a little further. Okay, so that, and then it begins to stretch. Essentially what that does is it tells it not to begin the scaling process until the distance actually achieves 2.98. And at 2.98, then the joint change is basically perfectly straight. And that was sort of an arbitrary guess, but it doesn't take too much. Now, the last part of making sure that our joint structure is going to scale appropriately with our rig, let me show you a demonstration. Now, currently, neither one of the leg joints are going to necessarily work appropriately when it comes to scaling. When I scale it down, things look great, right? And things seem to be stretching, just the stretching doesn't really entirely work. Notice the leg is being left behind because the distance between the hip and the ankle has changed. Okay? And so that needs to be updated in our global scale node. And that will be this one here. And so to do that, we need to take our scale value here, our global control, my main, and we need to connect its scale outputs into that node. So with my main control curve selected, I'm going to go to Window, General Editors, Connection Editor, and show non-keyable, disable show non-keyable. So now I have its scale attributes available. I'm going to use Y because that corresponds to essentially the height of the character, and that's usually going to be more consistently affecting the legs. And so with that selected, I need to again go to my hypershade, and I need to load up that node. So utilities, and then I find my global scale node, reload that to the right side, and now I need to feed, if you recall, the input X contains our default distance value. So I'm going to connect the scale to the input 2X. So I'm going to expand the input 2X and then connect my scale Y. You can be any one of them, it doesn't matter, it's up to you. I'm going to feed it into my input 2X. So now When I look at that node, you see that it highlights yellow. That's because it has its direct input is coming from our scale value. Now, I have the other leg, which I created using my script that actually builds the setup, and it hides certain components and protects them. It's not connected to the scale. So if I scale up, you can see that the right leg, which is not connected in to respond to the scale change, it basically kind of freaks out because it thinks the leg is actually extending, which in a way it is because the character is scaling up, so the leg is getting bigger. But the leg on the left side is actually paying attention to the scale change and is taking it into consideration because of the connection that we just made. So now if I select my control for that leg and I translate it, notice how it still slightly allows it to overextend relative to my slight change in the value, and it also now scales and it still bends and everything works normally. And that's because it's actually paying attention to the scale change. And that's exactly what you want to happen. Okay? So if I wanted to get this one to do the same thing, I'd essentially just have to make sure I'm connecting it into my scale node that's paying attention to the distance change. And so I need to find its nodes and do that. So simply same thing. Hypershade, utilities, find the node that's controlling its scale change. In this case, I called it gen scale as in generic scale. And I need to feed the global into that value. And so select my connections, window, general editors, connection editor. Since I selected both of them, it loaded both of them in. And now I need to feed the mains scale into the input. And then, I don't know if you saw that, but immediately once I made the connection, it reacted a little bit. So if I just nudge this curve a little bit, notice how now the leg is actually paying better attention to the scale change and is acting normally. And so that was pretty much it for Stretchy IK using 2 multiply divide nodes and a distance dimension tool. Now the last thing you probably want to do is you want to take all of the parts that are basically measuring, and you probably want to hide them. So right now they're constrained in and everything like that. Nothing's parented, so I can actually just take these and I can stick them in a group. Control G. Okay, and I can take those, give them a nice name like stretch parts group, and then I can set the visibility for that group to 0 just so I can hide all the parts I don't need to see. And you could even include that locator for the ankle into that group, because again it's constrained, not parented, right? And this way that's hidden too, but even though they're hidden, they're still connected and paying attention to the hierarchy like they need to. I think I accidentally grabbed the IK handle, which was parented, because that needs to stay connected. And there we go. Okay, so that's pretty much it. Stretchy leg using multiply divide nodes and limiting scale on the joints affected by the stretch.